see the numbers have slowed down a bit, so we will kick off. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this information session on the Apprise Audit platform. My name is Phoebe Ewan. I'm with the Mekong Club, and I'm joined by my colleague from United Nations University Institute in Macau, Dr. Hanya Tinyane, today. We are going to be walking you through the Apprise Audit project. This is a collaborative project between our two organisations, the Mekong Club and United Nations University Institute in Macau. Now, to kick off, I'll just introduce a little bit more about my organisation, the Mekong Club. I'm Programme Director for the Mekong Club. We are an NGO based in Hong Kong that looks to combat modern slavery through private sector engagement. So we aim to really act as a catalyst for change, engaging, inspiring and supporting the private sector to lead in the fight against modern day slavery. Now, we do this by a business association model. So you can see on the screen here our current member companies. Our business association includes companies spanning across various different industries, covering financial services, hospitality, retailing, manufacturing, and technology. We work very closely with these organizations. We regularly convene these organizations in confidential working groups. And together we identify the trends related to modern slavery, the challenges that companies are facing in effectively combating this crime, as well as the opportunities that we have as a global community, particularly with regards to the private sector, for greater collaboration in this space. So the Apprise Audit platform was in large part inspired by the many conversations that we have had with these organizations and many others around the various different challenges that they face when it comes to combating modern slavery, both within their own operations and then more generally within their industries as a whole. And as a result, we through these conversations, we build such technologies and such solutions to better equip organizations to combat this crime. Now, the particular risks that we are addressing here come from conversations mainly around the kind of supply chain side of modern slavery. So when we're talking about modern slavery to begin with, we're really talking about any person who is being forced to work against their will. Now, modern day slavery manifests itself in many, many different ways. So the means that are being used to keep someone in place may be less obvious than them being physically locked into a factory or locked onto a farm. Workers are often required to pay very high recruitment fees, for example, in order to secure a job. In certain industries, this is particularly prevalent around or within the migrant worker community. So you may find that workers moving from one country to another to, say, work in a factory location are required to pay recruitment fees in their home country to an employment broker to secure that role, as well as various different fees in order to travel to the location, fees for their training, fees to obtain the right working permits, and then even additional fees to the factory or to the recruiter at the other end. Now, these recruitment fees are sometimes legal, often they're illegal, and sometimes they can really make up a very significant proportion of that person's wages. Now, when these recruitment fees become excessive, they can even amount to bonded labour, whereby someone is being held in place purely because they need to work to pay off these very high fees that they've paid. We also find issues around employment contracts, so workers potentially not having access to their employment contracts or having signed fraudulent employment contracts or contracts that weren't written in a language that they can understand, leading to various obvious complications when it comes to proving their employment terms and conditions and ensuring that they're being paid what they expect to be paid. We also see issues around wages being deducted, wages being withheld from workers, ultimately workers not being paid the wage that they were promised, which can amount to essentially forced labour. We also see issues around document retention. So in order to keep workers in place, sometimes their identity documentation, their passport, for example, might be confiscated from them. They may be too afraid to then go and seek help, especially if they are in the situation without the proper work permit. And then finally, we see many issues around kind of living standards and living conditions that may not necessarily amount to modern slavery, but can also indicate or point to a potential wider issue of exploitation. Now, in order to assess for these kind of risks that may indicate modern slavery, many companies will conduct what is called a social audit. So this is essentially a process where a company will kind of go into a factory, go into a supplier location, and do various checks around the working conditions within those locations. Now, a key part of this social audit process is the worker interview. So in your traditional social audit, a number of workers will be selected, they'll be sat down and they'll be interviewed on their working conditions. Now, I'm sure you can imagine this can shed a lot of light on the reality of the situation and allow you to better understand the working conditions beyond simply looking at the kind of paperwork that might be in place. Now, we were finding the kind of years ago when we were looking to embark on this particular project, we were finding a number of challenges within the social audit process that meant that the number of victims being identified, or the number of potential victims of modern slavery being identified, was relatively low. And we were looking to uncover what were the kind of barriers within that social audit process that meant that this was happening. So we interviewed over 100 social auditors. We spoke with many of the brands within our business association network. And we really took a deep dive into how your traditional worker interviews are structured, what the kind of conditions are within those interviews, to uncover what the potential barriers to success in uncovering potential victims could be. So we found a number of challenges. The first being inclusivity and privacy. So many times workers would be interviewed maybe in groups by a social auditor, so they might be surrounded by their peers. Their manager may even be in the room. And it was generally considered that we can't be particularly confident that workers are speaking freely about their conditions, especially if you're thinking about quite sensitive employment conditions and questions around potential forced labour concerns, if they are kind of under peer pressure or there's fear of punishment should they speak up. We also found significant language barriers. Sometimes social auditors going into a factory may not speak fluently the language of the workforce. This is especially an issue when you have factories with many different kind of countries of origin of migrant workers within. And this meant that often certain populations within factories were being excluded from the interview process simply because there wasn't the language capabilities to speak to them. We also found inconsistencies within the data collection process. So when looking at multiple social audits that have been conducted, even by the same organization, we found that, you know, different auditors have different kinds of training, different auditors focus on different issues. And we essentially found that consistently the 11 ILO indicators of forced labor, so, you know, forced overtime, potential child labor, et cetera, it's not covering all of the potential red flags that may be there. So with all of these various challenges in mind, we thankfully were able to join up with UNU Institute in Macau, and we embarked on the Apprise Audit project. So I'm now going to pass over to Dr. Hannah Tignane to introduce the platform. Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, thanks, Phoebe. So as Phoebe said, my name's Hannah. I'm a principal researcher at UNU in Macau. Just a very brief background on UNU. Our job is to do policy impactful research on behalf of member states and UN bodies, looking at the intersection of ICTs and sustainable development. Obviously, this project looks at ICTs and decent work, or identifying victims of human trafficking. So let's start, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Just to give you an understanding of how Apprise Audit is used in worker interviews. Before we start, there's a little bit of background of setup that has to be undertaken. Within Apprise Audit, we have a grouping called an organization, and that represents each different company that is using Apprise Audit. When we create an account for an organization, we set an organization administrator. And that is someone often in the head office who has oversight over different teams of auditors. We give them the privileges to be able to create groups within their Apprise Audit organization, to assign auditors to the groups, and to set various sharing permissions. We do this in order to make the system try and replicate the sharing permissions and the processes that are already in use within the organization. So let's assume all of this has been undertaken. So we have an organization which has its own account now in Apprise Audit, and the organization administrator has added groups or teams of auditors, and the teams have auditors themselves who are able to go out and undertake worker interviews. Organizations also add their own factory identifiers. So this allows you again to map onto existing processes that you use within your organization and map them into Apprise Audit. So, okay, let's assume all of this background stuff is now done. That's really the registration side on this flowchart. When an auditor wants to go and do an interview, they install the app onto their mobile phone. And they log in and they download the most up-to-date question lists that their organization has access to. So it's important that the first login has to be somewhere with internet connectivity, because that's where we get things like the most recent translations, the most recent languages, and push them to the auditor's phone. So once all of this content is on the phone, then the interview can be undertaken in places where there is no network connectivity. This allows us to ensure that an auditor is able to go into places, maybe not their home network, or a place where they have Wi-Fi access, and still undertake interviews. So, okay, let's just again assume I'm an auditor. I am going to go do a factory inspection. I get there, I do my site inspection, I find my sample, and on my phone, I select the questionnaire that I want them to undertake. We have different questionnaires with different kinds of questions, and we'll get onto that a bit later. So as the auditor, I select the questionnaire, and then I hand my phone as well as a set of headphones to a worker. And now the workers just go through one at a time the interview, answering the questions. If they would like, there's an opportunity to leave their contact details if they want to be followed up with afterwards. And so each worker will finish, and the last screen says, thank you, please leave your contact details if you wish. Now hand on the phone to the next worker. So this allows the workers to do the interviews while the auditor, maybe they're present, maybe they're also doing other inspections that are around. So once that interview process is finished, we move to step 4, which is the auditor views the responses. So Apprise Audit will collate all of the feedback that has been obtained at a particular factory on a particular day on the phone until the auditor decides to then upload it to their account. So from this, what the auditor can see is the key indicators of exploitation or vulnerability that have been reported by the workers. From there, once the auditor has gone through the responses, they can then upload them to their organization account, and they can monitor the results later, maybe when they're back at their desk. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of what the actual screen looks like, I mentioned that before the auditors go out to the factories, what they do is they upload factory lists. And so this first screen here shows the process of selecting a factory and confirming that's where you want to undertake the interview. The second step, again, is where we have headphones that the worker uses to make sure that they can privately listen to questions and respond to them. So this the second screen here is the list of different languages that are available. When a worker selects a language, it says the name of that language in the language and says press the green button to continue. After this, we see in the middle panes here the landscape panes. We see at the top an example of the introductory video. This states the purpose of the interview in the language that has been selected. It demonstrates how the interface works and asks for consent to continue. So if consent is given, then what happens is we cycle through this list of questions. Again, all of these are audio translations and recordings of our different question lists. And the worker has a chance to respond either no, I don't know, or yes. They can also repeat the question or go back and forward through the list. So I mentioned earlier, there's a point at the end, which we don't have a slide on here, where they can leave their phone number if they want. And the final screen here shows the summary of the vulnerabilities that were identified. You can see here that the screen shows the responses from 23 interviews over a specific date range. Next slide. So once the responses are uploaded to the server, then the auditor and their organization can go through and do post-hoc analysis. You can see here the groupings that I referred to. So in this case, we're grouping by factory code and by date, which refers to the different sessions that were undertaken at the factories. And you can see a summary of the indicators of exploitation that were identified. Now, we must note that hopefully we don't get that many responses when people do work interviews in the field. This is all fake data that I generated just to make sure that we're able to demonstrate the functionality that's available. If the worker, if the auditor clicks on one of these groupings, you can actually drill down to reveal all of the different responses to each of the surveys. So if you just click for the next one. So this shows the responses. In this case, there was a survey that was undertaken in English by a female. The indicators that were identified are listed up the top. And then if you go down to the bottom of the screen, you can go through each of the different questions. Okay, sorry, next one. We also, because each of the responses is yes or no, as a computer scientist, it's amazing to be able to analyze this information. So we added this analysis functionality here to allow post-hoc analysis by each of the organizations of their own responses. So here you can see that we have different filters. So you can filter by the question list that was asked, the group, which refers to the team within the organization who collected the information, the language of the respondent, the gender of the respondent, or the indicators that were identified. So in this case, we're looking at the topmost questions that were answered to show vulnerability. So in this case, in my fake data, 61 people, which is 23% of the sample, said that their supervisor or employer has forced them to take a pregnancy test. So you can see how this would be really useful to help the organization understand the specific practices that are evident within their supply chain. Next slide. So what we found, I guess, early last year by now, so in March last year or April last year, as you all know, had the COVID-19 outbreak started, and this had significant impacts on the ability for companies to be able to do in-person inspections. So a group of our collaborators who've been using Apprise Audit within their supply chains got together and they asked us if we could look at pivoting Apprise to be able to respond to these COVID-19 conditions. So specifically, they asked us to look at two things. So first of all, when there's complete movement restrictions in countries, how can they still collect data, especially when they couldn't send auditors out to do in-person inspections? We understood that these conditions, it was really important for companies to be able to understand, especially when these conditions could change so quickly. The second situation was partial restrictions in other countries, where they wanted to capture COVID-19 specific practices at work. So when there was still movement that could occur. So the second of these, we just easily added a new question list. The first one, it's fine, let's stay on that page. Can you go to the cartoon page, please? So we added new functionality that allowed us to get feedback from participants, so workers, without having to have an auditor present. So this is our little cartoon that really demonstrates from the worker's perspective how this would happen. So the worker or the employer in the top left corner is sent a QR code as well as some instructions, and they're supposed to post that somewhere where workers have free access and are not surveilled and have access to their own mobile devices. So the printout has a QR code that the worker can scan. There's also a URL for those who don't want to use their camera or don't have a camera. And the idea is that the worker, in this case, uses headphones on their own device and undertakes the interview themselves. If you go to the next page, we can just see how this works. So the use case for this is that a brand would create a QR code and send it to each factory. And the factories then, as I said, print out the QR code, have it available for the workers to scan and take part in the survey themselves. And as you see here, we can see that in the first panel, that's someone scanning a QR code. Once the scan is undertaken, it goes immediately to that language selection page. So by creating this remote session, we already specify our question list and our factory code ourselves. So two of those steps that normally an inspector would do themselves in person are done in creating the remote session. And the third part of this screen really shows how we include the results from in-person as well as remote audits on the same interface. You can see with my little blue boxes, I have highlighted that the interviewer in the case of remote ones is called anonymous. Otherwise, the auditor's name is present there. So that's how we allow you to collate the results together, but still indicate when information is collected remotely. I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Phoebe. Yes.
Thanks so much, Hannah. So we are going to have a little bit of time at the end of this for questions. If you guys would like, feel free to just pop them into the chat box on Zoom or message them to myself directly, and I'll make sure that they are all addressed. Had a few questions come in already, and hopefully we'll address some of these during this next segment, where I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiences in actually implementing this out in the field. So with regards to how companies are actually integrating this this technology into their social audit processes, we have a number of companies across a few different industries very actively using this platform at the moment. It's very much an operational tool that's out there, and we're very, very keen, of course, to sign more companies up to get this out to even more people and reach more workers. Often companies will choose to incorporate the Apprise Audit app into their regular social audit processes. So it's kind of considered to be a tool to equip auditors when they go into factories to conduct more efficient, more effective worker interviews. Now, most companies still are conducting some face-to-face interviews, but they are using this as an additional layer to allow for more standardization of data collection, so that they know, in each audit, they are collecting data points that cover all of the ILO indicators of forced labor. Now, some companies are choosing to mandate the use of this across all of their social audits. Others are taking a more risk-based approach. So they are using the Apprise platform where they identify there may be potential issues and they're looking to dig a little bit deeper. It's very much in the hands of the company using the app, how they choose to implement this and how they choose to roll this out. Some organizations prefer to use the platform in a more ad hoc way. So maybe outside of their more regular social auditing, they might be conducting more kind of ad hoc data collection through using the app with workers. It's important to note that the functionality described by Hannah, both the in-person smartphone app and the delivery of the questionnaire via QR code, is all managed by the very same backend. So you, as say a company, would be able to set up your audit teams, be able to upload all of your factories, and you would be able to choose whether you deliver those questionnaires via QR code or whether you equip your social auditors with the smartphone app, or both. It's all the same platform, and it's all completely up to the user how they choose to manage that data collection process. As Hannah showed you, you're able to distinguish on the back end when you're doing your data analysis piece which interviews were conducted via the app and which were conducted by the QR code. As you can see, the interviewer as anonymous, of course they don't have a name, if the QR code has been used to collect the data. At the moment, we are kind of working mainly with internal audit teams of companies, but this can also be used by third-party social auditors if so desired. We really have created this to be as flexible as possible when it comes to the implementation, to fit into your existing processes and your existing preferences as an organization. And the data privacy structuring reflects this. So as Hannah mentioned, you're able to have different user profiles on the back end of the platform. You're able to have an organizational admin person or organizational admin team who can then set up different groups, and you can split out the data sharing into those groups. To give you a real life example of this, say you have a company head office team would like to be the organizational admin, and then you would like a team for the Vietnam audit team, the China audit team, the India audit team. Each of these separate audit teams, the auditors within only see the data collected within their group. And you can change this, you can change it so data is shared more widely, you can change it so it's restricted, even down to just the auditor level. Now, with regards to the global reach of the platform, we currently have 17 languages available right now on the app, on the platform as a whole. These are very easily added to. So we're continually developing new languages, depending on the needs of the users, essentially. So if, as a company, you're looking to implement this in a new country with languages that aren't available on the screen here, it takes a couple of weeks to do the translations, to do the recordings, to kind of verify everything, and then upload those onto the platform. We're continually looking to add to this because we understand that the more languages are available, the more people will be able to reach with this technology. And we are currently now implementing in over 15 countries around the world. You'll see the languages on the screen are relatively Asia-centric at the moment. That's largely driven by the fact that the majority of the supply chains of the companies using the app are based in Asia. But that's not to say it can't be implemented elsewhere. It's designed to be very intuitive, very user-friendly, and like I said, very easy to add new language onto. In the last month alone, we reached over 6,000 workers, 6,000 people reached by interviews, and that would be a combination of the delivery via QR code for those locations harder to get to due to COVID, as well as interviews conducted through the in-person app. And it's really fairly universal when it comes to the kinds of industries that this can be implemented in. So we have a standard kind of question list that companies tend to use that covers all of the ILO indicators of forced labor. A lot of the indicators or the red flags, say around things like recruitment fees, forced overtime, are kind of applicable across any industry. There is the potential, should an organization so wish, to develop their own specific question sets that are maybe more tailored to their particular industry type. we have experience doing this when it comes to implementing Apprise, maybe within more the kind of frontline NGO sector, looking, say, for example, at phishing as a particular industry where there might be specific questions to phishing that you'd be wanting to ask. Now, with regards to the kind of feedback that we have been getting from the organizations using the platform, certainly we are able to reach through this technology workers who have not been interviewed before, kind of anecdotal feedback around workers who speak languages that maybe their audit teams are not fluent in, who haven't been interviewed in 20 plus years or ever been interviewed at all, are now able to be reached using this platform. And it's considered to be a very intuitive, very easy to understand from both the kind of company side, auditor side, but also crucially from the worker side. Everything is delivered in the worker's own language. It's delivered via a headset. They don't need to be able to read at all to access this technology. We are identifying red flags and indicators that have not been identified before. We've had feedback around issues being uncovered that the companies hadn't necessarily even thought to ask about before. Again, kind of going back to that consistency of data collection piece. Of course, during COVID, many companies had to act very, very quickly to try to kind of continue to collect data during these times. And we were able to allow for this technology to be used very quickly to act as almost like a stopgap while this kind of process was occurring. It's important to note as well that the Apprise Audit app does work offline. So in factories where maybe there's not very good Wi-Fi or no data, workers can still conduct the interviews. They go through the same process. Everything can still occur offline. Once the device that is used to conduct the interview then connects back to the internet, then the results can be uploaded into the back end. But that immediate contact and that immediate reaction is not hindered by lack of internet. And then finally, we're finding it very easy to scale across countries, across industries, different facilities and tiers, due to the kind of simplicity of the interface and due to the way that the technology has been designed. So with that, I am going to open up a little bit of questions. I can see quite a few coming in on the chat, so I'm just going to open up the chat here. Bear with me one second. Many great questions on the chat, so thank you all so much. Okay. Okay. So the first question is around the user interface. Are workers able to skip questions or go back and listen to questions again? Yes, they are. In the introductory video, this is explained to the workers. There's a small skip button and there's a go back or go forward button. So if workers get partway through and they kind of think, oh, I want to change my answer to that question, they can simply go back and resubmit their answer. That's absolutely fine. We have a question also about languages. So how about particular dialects that are very crucial to India, say, for example, or to Thailand, for example? As I mentioned, it's fairly easy for us to develop and add new language capabilities to the app. So this is not a limitation, and it's something that we have been working on. So we have a question more widely around the auditor's independence, or whether companies hire the auditors. This completely depends on the organization. So some companies have their own internal audit teams. Some companies engage with third-party audit suppliers. Many companies do a combination of both. Companies may conduct unannounced kind of surprise spot check type audits, or they may conduct pre-planned audits. It's really a combination, and this technology fits into any of these scenarios. Essentially, if an audit is taking place or an interview is taking place, this technology can be incorporated into there. So I'm just looking through the questions. Are all the worker interview questions yes or no questions, or does the question contain open questions as well? So Hannah, I don't know if you wanted to give any input on the kind of design of the mapping.
Yeah, It's a good question. We use yes or no worded questions for a number of reasons. First of all, it's easier to have an interface to internationalize if it's all yes, no responses. And we had heard from auditors that literacy levels were low. So we didn't want to have any text-based responses, knowing that people wouldn't be able to respond to them. So quite a lot of our questions use branching. So if I want to ask you about your contract, I might say, did you receive a contract? If you said no, I didn't receive a contract, then I'll skip a whole heap of other questions that I'd have in store for you. If you said yes, I'd say, well, do you have a copy of that contract? And was the contract in your language? And do your conditions of work match what was in your contract? So you can see how I can still get quite a lot of information, but still using these yes, no worded questions.
Thank you. And one more for you, Hannah. Do we have any data around kind of how long it usually takes a worker to complete the questionnaire?
Okay, so that depends on the language. Some languages, for example, Burmese, are very verbose. And our full question list, which contains, I think, 41 questions, it probably takes around 8 to 10 minutes. That is the most verbose language that we support. Other languages are around 5 minutes. And again, it depends on the responses from workers. So just like in my example with the contract, if I asked you, you had a contract and you said no, well, then I would skip to 7 questions. So it's kind of like around 5 to around 10 minutes is my answer.
Thank you. So one question asks for us to clarify a bit more around how the QR code functionality works in practice. So generally speaking, companies are using the QR code functionality to deliver interviews when they physically can't travel to be in a factory. And some are kind of using a combination of both the app and the QR code version. Now, if they can't travel, on the back end, the auditor or the company, the admin person for the company is able to select the factory in question from their factory list that they've uploaded. And they're able to simply press a button, select the question list, and generate a QR code for that factory. Now, that QR code is then sent to the factory management. It's a QR code and a URL if for some reason they can't scan, sent to the factory management, and they are instructed to display that QR code either in the canteen, in the toilet, somewhere public, and or distribute the QR code to workers individually. The workers are then encouraged to scan that QR code on their own devices and fill out the questionnaire in their own time. It's very much the same process in terms of the interface. So maybe if I just go back to the interface so you can see. So it's very much the same process. Once they scan the QR code, they select the flag of the language that they speak. A short video plays then explaining what the platform is and what is happening and how to respond to the questions. They go through the questionnaire, and then once they complete that data input, the auditor or the company is able to see that information having come in. On the back end, it looks like this. So when the organization is in the data analysis phase, under interviewer, you can see anonymous. So anonymous means that no auditor conducted the interview, it was conducted via QR code. So the data is still structured in the very same way on the back end. I hope that makes sense.
There's some questions about how do you authenticate the auditor and the worker to avoid fraud and abuse. With the app itself, so the in-person interviews, the auditor has to log in, and so that's how we authenticate the auditor. With the QR code, that is one of the concerns that anybody has with remote collection of data. How do we know who is responding to questions? With the QR code, we don't know who is responding to questions. That was one of the points that we brought up even in our very first meeting, and it was my big concern that we'd have an employer out there who is just scanning the QR code multiple times and undertaking an interview themselves. And I was told by Even somebody who's in this tab, I can see their name, that they don't get bonus points for compliance. Like compliance is just the bare minimum. So it's not like it's too much to their advantage to get this information.
Yeah, and I think with regards to the QR code version, it's kind of seen as it's like well, there's kind of no other way to conduct this process really outside. So it's kind of like we're trying to collect data where otherwise we wouldn't be able to. And certainly some of the users that are using the QR code have given us feedback to say that it's allowed them to identify potential issues and then follow up with the factories where otherwise they'd have absolutely no oversight over what's going on in that location during COVID, which is especially concerning considering how some of the countries' travel restrictions continue to get worse.
I see another question about the question lists. There's a question saying, why are there more questions in the full version of the question list compared to the COVID-19 question list? So when we did that initial meeting with people to figure out what we wanted to do, basically, we were advised that our full list is very comprehensive, like talks about everything, including other toilet doors and things like that, you know. And we were told that for the COVID-19 one, because it's something that's going to go on a the worker has to download the audio each time they listen to a question. We wanted to make sure that our question list was as brief as possible. So we removed, I think, say 1/3 of the questions, or maybe a little bit more than that, and added 6 or 7 extras about COVID-19 conditions. So the virtual one has a different introduction because there's no auditor standing there in front of them and it says, thank you for scanning QR code or whatever. So it has a different introduction and a different a subset of the questions with these additional COVID-19 questions.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question, does the app function as a grievance mechanism for workers? I guess it kind of depends on your definition, but we've really tried to kind of differentiate, I guess, from your usual grievance mechanism or your usual kind of like worker voice app, where workers are relied upon to download an app onto their phone and be kind of their own accord interacting with that app, using their own data, using their own space on their phone. We've really designed this to integrate into the social audit kind of process, or to be driven by the company or audit team or audit provider side of things. So when the auditor goes into the factory, the workers aren't required to download anything. They aren't required to use their own data. They aren't required to use up space on their phones. They're simply presented with a device. They complete the questionnaire, and then that process is done. Even when they scan via the QR code, the data that they input is not stored on their phone. They're taken to a URL, they input the data as usual, and then the data comes to the back end, again, all completely driven by the company, audit team, or audit provider. See if there's any other questions.
There's a question, can auditors see the results by group or individual or both? And the answer to that is both. So you can select by grouping or by session, and then you can drill down from that to say, for these sessions, I want to see each individual interview that happened. Or there's a second tab. Could you go back to that screen that we have the responses on? Yeah, that one here. So if you see that it says interviews by factory, so that's the grouping by factory. So by interview session, and if you clicked on the interviews by individual, it would have each one listed one by one. So then you can also have filters that you can see there. So filter by date, by the question list, by the group. So that's the team, by the language of the respondent, by the factory code, by the gender of the respondent, and by the indicators that were raised in the interview.
There's a couple of questions around kind of how we might say vet auditors, or how we manage the data collection. When I say we, I mean Mekong Club and UNU. It's really important to note that we provide this technology, but the process, the implementation, how the data is managed, how the data is analyzed, follow-up actions, you know, who the app is provided to within your teams is very much managed on the company's side. We understand that different companies operate differently. There's confidentiality issues. We really provide the platform, we provide the training. We're of course there if you uncover things and you want to talk through the data that you're looking at. But we very much expect the companies and work with companies to drive this themselves. So like I said, different companies are implementing this in different ways. Some are equipping their internal audit teams, some are working with third-party providers, some are using the app, some are using the QR code, some are using both. We don't manage that process, we simply provide the technology.
There's a question about who owns the data as well. So the organization who collects the data owns the data. And then who has access to the data? Again, we talked about how each organization can set sharing permissions. So they can share within their whole organization to everyone. They can share within their groups of their organization. They can share only to the organization administrator and the group administrator, who might be, say, the team leader. That's all up to the organization.
Great. Interesting question around the impact on the use of this during COVID-19, like even in relating to sharing headsets and things like this. So generally speaking, we've seen a massive, obviously, uptake in the use of the QR code version during this time for this reason. So some companies are actually, besides delivering the QR code really remotely, they're also choosing to equip their auditor when they go into the factory with the QR code, that this can also be done. So the auditor in the factory, if say they don't have like an over-ear headset, or you know, if they have concerns around sanitation when it comes to headsets, they can present the QR code to the workers and the workers can scan the QR code while the auditor's physically in the factory. That's another way to use the platform to kind of mitigate for this kind of risk. One more question was around the number of interviews that can be conducted during one social audit process. As many as you like, essentially. So if you're physically going into the factory as an auditor, you can bring multiple devices, log in using the same login to each one, and then have, say, 5 workers all complete the interview at the same time. This is great because it clearly allows you to collect more data. So there's not really a kind of limit on that. I think we may have covered all the questions. I'm just going to scan through and double check. Thank you so much for all of the great questions. So as we have mentioned, we are really keen to engage more companies in Apprise Audit. I encourage you to reach out to us, either to me directly or via the info@themekongclub.org email address on the screen here to discuss more. This platform can really be tailored on a company by company basis. We're very, very open to discussing how this might work within your organizations. We're very open to providing the platform for trial usage. So yeah, really encourage you to get in touch. Likewise, if you have any further follow-up questions or any comments on the presentation today, or more generally around Apprise, feel free to be in touch with us. So that's info@themekongclub.org. And then finally, I am going to bring up a QR code. So if you are interested in signing up to the Mekong Club newsletter, you can scan the QR code on the screen here. We put out regular news on modern slavery, on the work that we're doing, on our membership. So feel free to sign up. Thank you so much, Hannah, for presenting with me today. Hopefully that was an interesting session. Please.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.